Welcome to the TOA On Air podcast, another edition. And today I'm talking to Eric Holthaus, who is a climate journalist, founder of The Phoenix, a publication devoted to radical change in the climate emergency. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you so much.
You've also previously been a writer for the Wall Street Journal, for Quartz. I read a few articles on Slate. And you recently published a book called The Future Earth, a Radical Vision for What's Possible in the Age of Warming. You've also been called a rebel nerd of meteorology by the Rolling Stones, which I found the best quote on you so far. Why is that? Like, what's the, well, let's debunk this or decipher this. Like, what's the rebel and what's the nerdy part?
Great. So this is funny because I think for a long time we were in the meteorological sciences really afraid to talk about the truth as it is. I think that for a long time there was some confusion about proper behavior surrounding climate change, and I think that that I just didn't care. Honestly, I think it was like this was 10 years ago or so, and it was a moment when it felt like it was really, really important to make sure that we understood how important climate change was. It wasn't just a science issue, it was a humanity issue. So the future or the Inconvenient Truth had just come out from Al Gore. We were still years away from Paris, but had just finished the failed Copenhagen climate talks. And it just felt like an all hands on deck moment, and I just wanted to say that as often as I could.
And what was the reason you think that there wasn't the strive for meteorologists and climate journalists to make that case? Was it a lack of consensus, a lack of knowledge? Was it, what were the reasons for it? I read that not long ago, a study I found that nearly half of all US meteorologists did not believe that humans are the cause of climate change. How come?
Right. I think that it's a cultural thing. Really, it was a cultural moment. And to be fair, the science has come a long way in these past 10 years. And I don't think that I personally had anything to do with it, but it was just more and more people having revelations like mine that that this is a moment that demands us to go outside of our comfort zone. So I think meteorologists are that's where the nerd part came in. Meteorologists love data and numbers and looking at the weather. Looking at clouds is often a solitary activity. So there's a lot of introverts in meteorology. There's a lot of people that like to just focus on computer coding and making sure that their models work and making sure that their predictions are accurate. And I think that we have become much more collaborative over the past 10 years as a science. We have learned that the classic case is warning about tornadoes or severe weather. In the past, even 10 years ago, there was this instinct that meteorologists had was, if I create the perfect forecast, then people will receive it and people will act perfectly on it. And that will save lives. And it just wasn't true. Our forecasts were improving and the numbers of people who were injured and dying were staying the same. And people were really puzzled. And then we had a couple of really terrible tornado outbreaks in 2011, in April of 2011. I still remember watching across the southern United States. There were hundreds of tornadoes that day and hundreds of people died. One of the worst tornado outbreaks in the United States history. And everyone was sort of left with where did we go wrong? In the result, the major result from that event was that it wasn't the forecast. The forecast was great. It was the fact that you have structural racism, structural poverty, and a society that was told to fend for itself, especially in the southern United States, which is one of the poorest regions of the United States. Sort of intentionally left poor to make sure that they, this is a predominantly area of where Black people still live, where slavery was the law for 100 years, and it's still being sort of exploited now, 100 years after, more than 100 years after slavery was abolished. So, and all that matters to a weather forecast. We have to know who the people are, what are their living circumstances, what are they doing, what are they likely to be doing at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon when this forecast comes through. How can we meet them where they are, rather than just saying, if I punch my numbers in and it turns on a scrolling text across the television screen, that people will be there to receive it. Minimum wage jobs are often not in front of a computer terminal like like meteorologists sit. They're service industry jobs, and they're going to be unless they are set up to receive this information, or their employer sends them the information, they're going to be in danger, and their families will be, often working multiple jobs, often having multi-generational households. The children might be separated from the parents for a while as this is happening. All of that is being factored into weather forecasts now, and it never really was to this extent. So that is sort of the revolution that I thought needed to happen. And that's the revolution that still needs to happen with climate change. That's why we're not paying attention to climate warnings.
I guess that's where also the name eco-socialist comes from, right? That
Yeah.
I've read you referring yourself to.
Yes.
And so it requires not just a scientific undertaking, but this is actually a social issue.
Yes, it requires a structural change in society. It requires a cultural change in society. It requires us to treat each other, as we are, as we're all worthy of having a role in the world that's being built right now. It's not sort of a, again, 30 years ago, I think people thought climate action was something like, well, if we switch out the power plants that supply your electricity, or if we insulate homes, or if we increase energy efficiency, or if we all drive electric cars, then the problem will be solved. But it's such a deep cultural problem. Climate impacts everything. Climate impacts all aspects of society, from the food we eat, to where we sleep, to where our houses are, to the emotional tenor of our lives. Like we are, all of us, internalizing some degree of fear and guilt and uncertainty about the future now. Kids that are growing up now don't know if the world will be the same as it is now when they're our age. And that is terrifying. I don't know how it's hard to be a kid these days. And I think that until we have some sort of multiple society-wide initiatives that are inclusive enough to say, this is the scale of the problem that requires a solution on the same scale of restructuring the global economy. And I mean, to be blunt, that's what it's going to require. It's going to require an economic system that is not centered on extractive capitalism, that has for hundreds of years taken advantage of people and pushed the risk of living onto you know, wage earners. I think that if we built a society that was more centered on mutual aid and mutual respect, and us, you know, as Kate Raworth calls it, a circular economy, a donut economy, where we have on the outer boundary the very clearly defined planetary boundaries that we know we're running past now. And on the center, we have an inner boundary where it's basic social and human rights, guaranteeing that we have enough, that every person in the world has enough, not only to survive, but to thrive. We have those resources now. You know, for the first time in human history, we have enough where everyone can thrive, no matter how they were born, no matter what rare genetic diseases that they're born with. You know, we have enough to put attention on every single human. And beyond that, we have enough to put attention on every single species in the world, to make sure that species are not going extinct and ecosystems are not collapsing at a rate that threatens all of us. And, you know, I learned all of this by just paying attention to the weather and paying attention to climate scientists that say that in order to solve a problem of this magnitude, you have to change the way the system works. And listening to people who are on the front lines of this crisis tell me what they need to thrive. It's really as easy, it's been as easy as that, which is still a little bit confusing to me why it's so hard for us to take the action that we need.
So before we dive deeper into sort of some possible, you know, actions that we can take as individuals, as corporations, as countries, as you know, governors or governance structures, just, you know, briefly, and I feel like, you know, we want to spend a good part talking about that, because also your book seems to be hopeful, and also in your first statement here, you know, I sense that you have hope for us being able to take this ship into the right course. But just briefly, for those who may be, you know, still kind of digging deeper into this subject matter, like, how big is the actual problem at the moment? Like, what are we steering towards to? You were quoted as "we now stand on the brink of collapse." Can you just maybe paint us that, you know, dark picture for a second?
Sure. Yeah. So the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures from pre-industrial is very important. It's a very important target. And I think that the way it's been described is sort of an aspirational negotiation point in the Paris Agreement. But this is an existential threat for hundreds of millions of people around the world. In essentially every country in the world will have people whose lives are put in jeopardy by passing this this point. We're finding out now, even just last week, there was a new study that said that at global temperatures above 1.5, there will be regions of the tropics where the wet bulb temperature, the humidity, the absolute humidity in the air, the amount of water vapor that the air contains, will raise the perceived temperature. Our bodies need to have a certain level of humidity and temperature below which we can sweat and then evaporate moisture off of our bodies to cool ourselves. So there will be regions of the world which are already happening very occasionally, like once or twice a year in some cities, like coastal Pakistan or coastal Iran, those sorts of very unique places now. But it will be happening in widespread areas across the Earth's tropics, that human bodies are no longer able to cool themselves. That anyone outside for any length of time, beyond 15 or 20 minutes, will be at risk of hypothermia and death. And that essentially those places will be uninhabitable for certain stretches of the year. So, we have two choices. People can live inside in air conditioning, or we can stop that temperature rise from happening to save those regions. And that to me is one of the most striking consequences of this temperature target that is not too far away. We're right now at 1.2 or 1.3 degrees Celsius. 2020 last year was tied with 2016 for the hottest year in human history. We are now, in the early days and months in this sort of transition period out of the pandemic. We are now, as a global society, emitting more carbon than we did before the pandemic began. We are really rebuilding in the wrong way from this pandemic, and that has to change immediately. We're on a pace to lock in 1.5 degrees in the next 5 to 8 years. This is something that is extremely urgent. That's why I think all through the pandemic, which this message was lost a little bit, because clearly we were focused on saving each other's lives from this horrible disease. But what was lost a little bit was that, if you remember, right as the pandemic hit was right at the height of the school strike movement. And that's when, it seemed like the youth were on the verge of sort of dictating how the planet needs to shift. And that momentum has been lost as well. So we've not only made the problem worse this past year, but now we've lost the social movement, or a large part of the social movement to demand those changes. So we need something new. We need something else. I don't know what it's going to be.
And
has to happen soon.
Is there any silver lining in the sense that maybe the world has learned to cooperate on sort of a macroeconomic and political spectrum, multilateral spectrum?
I think the biggest achievement has been on the complete other end of the spectrum that you just mentioned. I think it's been in individual people's minds and in individual families. I think we've been confronted with a very scary year, a year where we had to rethink everything. Each of us, I was working from home before, but then I became also a full-time caregiver and a distance teacher to my kindergarten, my child in kindergarten. Everyone lost their in-person friendships. We have had to rebuild social networks and figure out a way to support each other and love each other through this very terrifying period. And I think that we've learned a lot about trauma and learned a lot about how we can do hard things if we have to. And it's not fun and it's not easy, but we were doing it for each other to keep each other safe. And that's the same spirit that needs to happen and the same intensity of action that needs to happen with climate. We know now the scale at which we need to keep acting for at least the next 5 to 8 years in order to make sure that everyone that doesn't have a job right now can have a job working on the climate emergency, working in a meaningful way of making the future a better place.
And I want to maybe structure let's say possible solutions or action that we can take as society a little bit by sort of going from macro to micro.
Okay, sure.
So on the political sphere, you have a new government, and what would you hope for become a priority for this new government?
Sure. Well, in the United States, we have the next item on the agenda, on the Biden-Harris agenda, is a massive climate bill. somewhere between $2 and $4 trillion they've been discussing, which is, you know, roughly 20 to 40% of the US annual economy is going to be invested into this single bill that will fund renewable energy. It will direct that money towards low income and communities of color. It will take a big step, hopefully, to restructuring American society in a very important way. That bill is going to be introduced and debated for the next few months. And I think that the outcome of that bill will be extremely important. So that they're talking about potentially also including something like a carbon tax on exports, or, you know, any goods and services leaving or entering the country will be subject to a carbon tax. That can quickly spread around the world. You know, if the American economy is imposing a carbon tax, then that will need to be felt in Europe. That will need to be felt in Asia. That will need to be felt all around the world. So that will help from a macroeconomic standpoint. But I'm really nervous of these sort of market forces, trusting market forces to solve things. But I think we also need to do a lot of regulatory work in the United States, and a lot of just directly legislating the things that need to change. Like we need to have funding for retrofitting every house in the United States. We need to have housing be considered a right in the United States and not a privilege. We need to have a job be considered a right in the United States and not a privilege. We need to have it not not impossible to survive. You know, I think when we go too far, which is where the United States has come, you have to literally pay money to survive here. And I think that's just not something that families need to be worrying about during this, you know, 5 to 8 year period where we all need to be giving everything we have into fixing this problem, in order to sort of free up people's family life and family attention. We need to also have, you know, funded childcare, which would have been very helpful over this last year, right? Like if you are working multiple jobs, you can't also watch your kids at the same time. So, you know, childcare is a climate strategy that's something that, you know, when you pay attention to the people's lives who are at the front lines of this crisis, that's the kind of solutions that they need. That's what they're asking for. And, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago, we would have never really considered that as a climate, climate action. Which is good that we have a government now that is willing to take those steps.
And would it also require, you know, sort of a common narrative, or, you know, is it more grassroots, or would it be helpful to have, you know, global leaders, you know, that can build a share and sell a shared narrative that people can buy into? I read somewhere that you were quoted also saying that, you know, this narrative it needs to go from dystopia towards something that is a bit more courageous and imaginative.
Yeah, you know, I think that's important. And I think that, you know, if you go back to Joe Biden's inaugural speech in January, he spoke a lot about courage and about this American spirit of nothing is impossible. If we decide to do it, we can do it. And that's a little bit like, you know, imperialist for me, but I think that you know, we already have you know, we can take NASA as an example. We have this the American space industry grew out of the defense industry in World War II, and it became centered on education and exploration and science. And it inspired multiple generations now of people all over the world to say that we can we can do great things if we come together. We can inspire people to dream bigger, to make to make to understand our place in the universe, really. And that's kind of what we are deciding now as a global civilization, is does humanity want to be this, like, for the next 500 years? Do we want to be this this sort of common collective group of people, of spiritualities and dreams, working together in all of our different ways of deciding our place in the universe? Or do we want to continue to stay fractured and fighting with each other? And that is what has led us to this sort of arms race of pollution and emissions, and understanding that, if I own a factory, I can pollute without caring where it goes, because it's not going to affect me or my kids. It's going to affect someone else's kids. Yeah. And that's the opposite mentality of what we need to survive, really, as a species from this point on.
And you mentioned imperialism, and it reminded me sort of the discussion, around the Amazon and just protecting rainforests being, a crucial and very impactful measure that we could be taking, because, for the obvious, reduction in burned carbon dioxide. But it also seems like, some form of almost carbon colonialism that's being quoted, right? In sort of rich nations telling, the rainforest countries, Brazil, etc., to stop deforestation, or, China to, have more clean energy. How are we going to solve that aspect? Is it incentive based? Should one, for example, better connect carbon credits to those regional communities that give incentive to, not deforesting? Or, like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think trees in general are very problematic in the way we think about them. Trees last for hundreds of years, and if you have a market-based carbon strategy that requires you to plant trees, there needs to be someone to watch those trees for a couple hundred years to make sure that the carbon stays out of the atmosphere. And trees already exist. There are people that live there. There's people that live in the Amazon. These are indigenous lands. I think what needs to happen is that we need to give more forests and more lands back to indigenous people, because they've done the best job of any of us to steward those trees and that land for hundreds and thousands of years. I think that is, you can read about studies of lands held in indigenous trust sequester more carbon than lands that don't. And that's true all over the world. It's the same strategy that should be held in the United States, that we should be in the active process of giving land back to indigenous people here. That is a climate, it's one of the most important climate strategies that we have. And I think that, I don't know, I'm not a politician or political scientist. I don't know how to convince the Brazilian government to do that. But the United States is a strong country. So is the EU, is a strong group of nations. China is strong. If it was in all three of our mutual interests to require Brazil of giving that land back, then maybe they would listen. I don't know. I'm not good with that sort of thing, but I know that is what the science says, and what basic human decency says needs to happen.
And I mean, alternative technologies, carbon capture, what are you hopeful for in terms of technology? And what role do you see technology play moving forward in solving this? Because there's been, a fair amount of innovation, but, we're from the startup world, sort of with Tor. I mean, if you look at just the capital that has been invested into consumer technologies, etc., it still pales what is being invested into climate action or climate technology.
Sure. I mean, it's been so fascinating in the last year to watch the Silicon Valley and venture capitalist world flock to carbon and climate and electric cars and carbon sequestration and imagining an entire, power system built on hydrogen. Or how are we going to power diesel trains? We can switch diesel trains to hydrogen fuel cells. Like we are in the active role of imagining how our machines are going to work for the next 50 years, or at least. So a lot of those companies that are being born right now are going to have those solutions. So, throwing a ton of money at these solutions and figuring out what works is going to be a good strategy. I'm also just tried to broaden the sense, broaden the definition of technology much further than what is currently commonly held, I think. Racism is also a technology. It's a tool that is used to achieve a purpose. And I think, I think that if, at least in the United States, it's a complete social construct. Like there are ways that we can focus on having people who are, at the front lines of the climate emergency involved in all of these conversations in Silicon Valley. The people who are affected most by climate change need to have not only a seat at the table, but a driving force in determining what technologies are going to become dominant. Because I'm not a huge fan of electric cars for the reason that I'm not a huge fan of cars. Like I would much rather have a future like Amsterdam or Copenhagen in the United States than just a Houston or a Los Angeles that just uses a different form of there are people, pedestrians, people who use people-powered transit, bicycles or electric scooters or any of that sort of thing. You have to design the city around the mode of transportation that you want. I would much rather have a more dense city where it's walkable and bikeable. That is a technology that should be used, instead of just saying, how can we develop a quick charging electric battery? We should think of, how can we develop a city block where people want to live and they're safe? And there are companies that are doing that. There are design companies that are startup design companies that are trying to say, we want the people to be living here to be safe and healthy and thriving. I mean, that's the whole point of technology in the first place, right? Is to give people tools to live better lives. And so I think I would just say that when we're talking about technology, we should broaden that that conversation as much as possible.
And speaking of technologies, and let's go to Bitcoin for a second, but it could be another technology, even electric cars,
Sure.
which obviously have other externalities, right?
Yep.
With the battery production, cobalt, etc.
Yes.
You've been very critical of Bitcoin. Actually, in preparation for this call, I asked a few of my most hardcore, Bitcoin believers about their opinion, and they would acknowledge, how electricity intensive it is currently. But they would say, and I haven't found actually studies confirming that there's a lot of and more, of the electricity being used for Bitcoin transactions comes from hydroelectric plants, and that the sort of energy used, needs to be compared to this saving in energy of all the industries that Bitcoin will replace. So that's kind of the Bitcoin narrative.
Sure.
How do you counter that?
Yeah, no, I think that I don't have a problem with cryptocurrencies at all in general as a technology, because I think there is a massive potential of democratizing money, really, democratizing finance. And I'm especially focused on some currencies like what's it called? I think there's it's Celo and Stellar, and even Ethereum is switching from proof of work to proof of stake. So there are proof of stake coins that are specifically focused on providing financial services specifically for places that are currently left behind in the financial system as it currently is. That's important work that should be done. And I understand the argument about incentivizing the switch to renewable power because we need to have every tool that we can get that will shut down coal plants, basically, around the world. The problem is that the way Bitcoin specifically is designed, it's designed to be the sort of arms race of machines solving increasingly pointless math problems and using an incredible amount of energy to do it, to secure the network, and to make sure that that the miners are paid for their work. So all of that is unnecessary. It's just not. I mean, we have different coins that work better, that require less than 1% of the use total. I mean, all the other coins combined require less than 1% of the energy that Bitcoin uses right now. And I just think it's unnecessary. And I think that it's really, to me, a example of capitalism gone nuts. Honestly, it's like here we have this. It's essentially an arbitrary thing that is being invested billions of dollars into, and as it currently sits, it's cannibalizing renewable energy from more useful technologies. Like you can also, I think one of the arguments is like, well, this energy was not being used. Like lately, there's been these videos circulating of natural gas flared out of oil wells. So that in the United States, at least, that natural gas would just escape to the atmosphere as methane, or it would be burned for no reason, flaring. It would be flared to try to turn it into CO2 at least, which has an 80-fold less carbon footprint than methane does. So they're saying, look, we're solving climate change by making use of this wasted energy. Well, we should not be drilling for oil in the first place. We should be shutting those oil wells down entirely and switching to if they wanted to solve climate change, they could be building and funding their own wind farms or their own solar panels, and then providing 80 or 90% of that power that's generated to the local community rather than to computer servers that are pointless. That's my point.
Let's talk about companies. So I read a staggering statistic that about 70% of all climate change since the Industrial Revolution was created by just 108 companies. I think it's also something you wrote. How should companies think about externalities? Like if we price them in, wouldn't that also lead to products that are too expensive and for people being specifically hurt in lower income classes and not being, like what's the fair way to deal with externalities?
Yeah, well, I think that, of course, at a minimum, that companies should be paying for the damage that they're causing, paying to undo the damage that they're causing. If you factor in, when companies like Exxon and Shell say we're striving to be a net zero carbon company, they're usually only talking about their company's actual business operations, like their first order emissions. They're not talking about the fuel that their consumers burn, that they are being sold. And if you broaden that definition and regulated based on that definition, then those 108 companies would be required to fund, the switch to zero energy for 70% of the world. And, that's not, they don't have that money to do that. Like you said, I think the problem is they would go out of business, and they would just leave it to their national governments to clean up the problem. So I think that, I think the solution here is that, first off, we should not, at least in the United States, we should not be allowing any future fossil fuel development, like no pipelines, no oil wells, no anything. We have enough right now. We have more than enough right now to have that transition to a zero carbon world. Like we can keep using what we have until we break that, until we get to the point where we have enough energy to replace it. But it would only take a couple of years if we were focused on this at 100% interest level. we would be able to build enough renewable energy to offset our fossil fuel industry pretty quickly. It would take a couple of years. Like it's not, I don't think it's as existential of a problem as a lot of fossil fuel companies like to say. And then those companies would go out of business as well, or they would be forced to innovate into becoming a renewable energy company. Like, you would just have to change their business model in order to do something that's not destroying the planet, basically.
And let's talk about our individual behavior. You famously pledged a no-fly sort of travel system for yourself, and it also went viral on Twitter. I saw you said get rid of the lawn was an article. You also wrote about almonds being actually more efficient water users than dairy or beef. So it's so hard, I guess, to navigate this if you're not totally committed to spending a lot of time in researching and so what would be some sort of quick wins, some of the things that you tell your family and friends, like the 5 things that really everybody should be doing?
Yeah, no, I think that it depends on who you are, first off. And I think that it's helpful to put your life and your habits into a carbon footprint calculator, just for your own interest, to sort of see what's my number 1 or number 2 big things, and because it might be surprising. For me, it was very surprising. I didn't realize that flying was 80% of my emissions. And so I was able to cut my emissions by 80% by stopping flying.
Are you still doing it?
Yeah. Well, I think we've I think there have been a couple of family vacations to where I have now given myself this sort of like once a year or once every other year for occasions that are important to us. But even still, that is more than the global average. 80% of people in the world have never, well, I think maybe it's 50, somewhere between 50, I can't remember right off, but somewhere between 50 and 80% of people in the world have never flown at all. So it is a very unequal way of burning carbon, that only wealthy people do it, basically. So I think, but what I have learned after that period where I decided that I would never fly again, I learned a lot about how your decisions also clearly impact others around you, impact your loved ones. So I decided to, in the future, be, also aware of what my family and friends do and need, and to say, like, to not be as extreme about it, because I don't think that extremism is what we're trying to we're not trying to live in a world with extremism. We're trying to live in a world where we get the consent of each other, and where we talk to each other and have conversations about the path we are heading down together. And that requires doing things that you feel uncomfortable doing, honestly, because it's going to help other people survive. It's a now like this is important because we started this conversation talking about, during the pandemic, we learned how to do hard things for each other. This is another example of that. So now we can think back to, like, remember when I wore a mask and lived inside for a year? Like, I can also start thinking about vacations differently.
It reminds me, yeah.
In Europe, you have the ability to travel the entire continent in a way that, if you have night trains, for example, you can wake up and be, half a continent away. And eventually we'll get there in the United States. but I've had some amazing vacations here within even walking and driving distance. For my 40th birthday a couple of weeks ago, we went and stayed in a hotel in another part of the city here, and were able to have a fancy meal and sit in the hot tub, and like it was nice. And we didn't have to go to the Caribbean for that.
And it reminds me, by the way, of something that our Minister of Health said at the beginning of the pandemic, which he became very famous for in Germany, where he said, there will be a lot of things that we will have to forgive each other for, as we are kind of navigating really uncharted territory, as long as, we have good intentions. And, are we kind of, I'm being mindful of the time, we have a few minutes left, so I'm coming sort of to the closing section. Future outlook. I mean, are we adapting to a warming world? Is that inevitable? How do you see these ideas of exploring Mars as the only opportunity for humanity to continue to exist? Like, how do you think really 100, 200 years down the line?
Sure. Yeah, I think that well, first off, we will still be having sea level rise 100 and 200 years from now. That's the sort of lag time that's built into the oceans. In terms of Antarctica will still be melting, even if we stabilize warming. It takes that long for the planet to adjust. I mean, that's and if you think about it, that's a snap of the fingers in the geological history. 100 years is hardly anything. So, but I think, if we work and do what we need to do in the next 10 to 30 years and stabilize climate at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think the most important thing we'll have learned is how to take care of each other. We'll extend these lessons from the pandemic. We will learn how to have a truly global society where we're cooperating, where we will be able to notice and appreciate the world around us in a way that we hadn't before. We will become, in some ways, an ecological civilization. We will have changed our behavior to make sure that our planet will continue to thrive. And so therefore we will also continue to thrive because we are part of this planet. We can't separate ourselves away from this planet. And I don't think that we will have a future necessarily on Mars or in other planets, because those planets were not made for, we are not adapted to those planets. And, it could be, tens of thousands of years from now that technology will radically change to where that's possible. but I don't think that should necessarily be a primary objective. I think we will be just fine here for a very long time. If we do what we need to do. I don't think we should sort of deviate from that focus that this is our home and it's a great place. You know, we can focus on our technology on detecting asteroids and in monitoring the sun and all of those things. But I think that we will have a future that is better than we could imagine right now, if we do what we need to do.
And then just finally, I've read you've been very open also about the sort of existential despair that you feel in this work, right? And I don't know if you would consider yourself an activist. Would you actually, or?
I mean, I think that I support activists.
Yeah.
And I think that as a journalist or as a scientist, that's also often will earn you the label of activist. I think that is my theory of change, is that we need to have a small group of very committed people to demand radical change. You know, there's a study from Harvard sociologist Erica Chenoweth who found that we only need 3.5% of the population of any given time to sort of rise up in a nonviolent revolution to make those demands met. And we were in New Zealand right before the pandemic. We had reached that in the climate strike movement. They reached 3.5% of people in the streets on one day.
And how would you go about like convincing or you know, inspiring the next generation of people to go down, you know, and rise up, considering that also, you know, when I talk to some of my activist friends, for example, like the hardship that comes with it and the sort of opportunity cost in, you know, not going down maybe the steady career can feel so immense.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for a lot of youth activists in particular, they don't see another path. You know, it's their future that's on the line. So, so it's something that's going to happen regardless of if there's money for them or not. You know, I don't think that. I think the rest of us can focus on making sure that their needs are provided for, because they're the ones that are really going to be determining their own future in ways, but they're asking us to change. We're the ones that have to change in order so that they can have a future. So I don't really think of it as, I think of it, my job is to listen, honestly, to what those demands are being asked of me. I think that's an important thing to do, is to be flexible and to try to be willing to understand where they're coming from, so you know how important this is.
Eric, thank you so much. Want to share your Twitter handle? I know you're very active on Twitter with a huge following.
Yeah, it's at Eric Holthaus.
Eric, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for all the inspiring thoughts you share with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.